Welcome to Hey Chaplain. My name is Jared Altick, and I'm a chaplain with the police department. This podcast exists so that cops can hear encouragement for the tough work that they do. I'm on a mission to bring encouragement and wisdom to police officers all around the world, mostly by interviewing other cops. On this podcast, you'll hear from detectives and dispatchers, U.S. Marshals and county sheriffs, and the occasional patrol sergeant from my hometown of Kansas City. From the LAPD to Scotland Yard, the guests on Hey Chaplain give you their hard-earned wisdom so that you don't have to do everything the hard way. This show is commercial-free because listeners who want to encourage cops buy me a $5 virtual coffee at buymeacoffee.com/HeyChaplain. You don't even have to do that. You already get the show for free. But thank you for making it possible for police officers to hear something positive. Today I'm talking to Gregg Dorsett. He's been a guest several times before, mostly on compilation episodes, but his first appearance was all the way back in episode 4. Today, he's a captain at KCKPD, and part of his job now is getting the patrol officers better equipment than what they've had in the past. He's had a hand in changing things from reports and records to body-worn cameras to how the department buys and equips patrol cars. This isn't as glamorous or as hands-on as most of Gregg's career, but that's exactly why I wanted to talk to him. You see, I believe that he has successfully made one of the toughest career transitions a hard-charging, hands-on, take-action kind of guy can make. The transition to support and administration. Here's Gregg Dorsett. Hello, Gregg. How are you today?
Great, Jared. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm doing great. I'm glad you're in today and able to talk to me. And I have a question for you. So, looking back over your career, how long were you an officer and a patrol sergeant? I mean, how long were you on the street?
A total of 22 years. I did 8 years in a patrol position and then was field supervisor for 14 years.
14 years as a sergeant.
It went fast. I look back and it's like, man, that's a long time. And then I thought about it and like, wow, that just kind of blew by.
Was all of that in patrol?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow. Right.
Yep.
So the whole time. You weren't moved around to some other desk position or anything, were you?
I got to correct myself. I got sentenced to the communication center. I say that tongue-in-cheek, sentenced. My very first year, the sergeant that was in communications wanted to stay there, so I was able to pull a patrol spot, and then there were some moves the next year, and I spent the next 2 years in communications. You know, when you're a young sergeant, you want to get out and run and go and be with your guys and be in the middle of work, and it was a complete change. I mean, very, very different. You're confined to one room. And actually, I mean, it was a huge learning experience, and there was some great stuff to pick up in there.
But there's a mindset, though, that getting stuck indoors is, you know, at a desk is the worst thing that could happen to an officer. Because most people who want to be on the street, they want to be out in the action.
Right.
They want to be, you know, out where the action's happening. And that's really tough to have that taken away from you because of injury or promotion. And so
both.
And so you were promoted to captain.
And I had a pretty honest conversation with the chief when he called me. I was the next one up on the list, and he called me. He's like, well, I can offer you this spot. And I was pretty honest with him. I had done a total of 9 years on midnights and knew what that did to my body. At first, when I started, it worked great. I could come home, go to sleep, get 7, 8, 9 hours of sleep, and I'd be great for, the rest of the afternoon and go to work. And then I got to the point where you have kids and busy things to do, and your sleep gets interrupted, and you go to court, and next thing you know, I was taking 3 naps a day rather than a good sleep cycle.
Right.
And I told him, I said, I can't do that. If you have to have a midnight guy, please move on to the next one. I know what it'll do to me, and I will not be functional.
Yeah.
And I ended back kind of at my old home. I had worked south a lot of years, so I ended up on South afternoons.
But eventually you got moved again.
I did. It was about 15 months later. got that phone call. It's that time of year. Promotions were coming. Some people were going to be moved around. And when the deputy chief calls, you kind of go, is this going to be a good thing, or is this going to be rough? And I was not excited at all. I was going to an admin spot over IT, records, data management, and asset protection. And honestly, I didn't know what they did.
Right. Okay.
I mean, I knew those units existed, and they ran all these systems, and they kind of just were the bread and butter behind the scenes that made the machine run. Mm-hmm. But I didn't know what I was going to be doing. I thought my career was going a different direction. I really thought that I was going to go to the Special Operations Unit and kind of have my mind made up. I'm retiring from there, and that's what I'm going to do. Mm-hmm. Except I'm not in that spot anymore. I don't get to determine the direction of my career all the time.
Yeah.
And
it's not like you had this notion in your head and you were the only one thinking it. I mean, there's a lot of the listeners probably, they don't know you. They can't see you. I'm sitting across the desk from you right now.
Yeah.
And you're an imposing guy who has, you've stayed fit. You are an aggressive person that wants to do things. You're a take charge kind of guy. I remember being on a ride along in a district that you were supervising, and you were a sergeant at the time. And we had somebody that had escaped on foot and was running through people's backyards, and we were going to cordon the area off and take care of it. So the officer I was with was, racing down one street to get in position and kind of block off that section. And we walked up the hill, and you got out of your car. And in KCK, we have these wooden batons that are like short baseball bats. And you get out, and you're in a short sleeve shirt carrying that baton. And I almost surrendered to you right there. And I didn't do anything. You're an imposing character, but you're an action oriented kind of person. So going from patrol to special operations just makes sense. If I'm calling central casting and trying to find somebody that would look like a special operations captain, you're the type I'm looking for. Instead, you're in charge of IT.
Yeah, I sure am. It's, I backtrack a little bit, and when the deputy chief was talking to me about it, and he could tell I was not real happy about it, he's like, hey, I recommended you for this spot. I'm like, man, you really don't like me, dude. he laughs. I mean, we have a pretty good relationship. We can talk pretty openly, and he goes, look at it this way. He said, you can do the field operation stuff in your sleep. You've done it your entire career. He goes, it's time for you to learn the other side of the house. And he goes, you have a lot to offer there. He said, you've run some projects, you've got some things done, and you don't need somebody to hold your hand to do it. And I said, okay. And
do you have any advice on how, if someone else gets called in and told, okay, now your career is going to make a dramatic turn into an area that you weren't expecting, how do you adjust to that? Well, you have any recommendations or
be
advice?
Very intentional about it.
What do you mean?
Take a minute to break it down and look at it. You don't have to go in and change things. And no good leadership does that anyway. You walk in, you observe, you see what's going on. You sit down with people and talk with them and figure out what they're doing and why they're doing it. So you understand the process before you ever put a finger on it. Records. I always knew they existed. I kind of had an idea what they did, but I didn't know all they did. Mm-hmm. Same thing with IT. I've learned more about computer networks and processes and how they work than I ever thought I would. But it's intriguing. And that encompasses, reports and video and storage and communications and getting stuff from dispatch to the field, back to records, back to storage, and how all of that happens. When you're in the field, you never think about it. It just happens or it doesn't. When it's broke, you call somebody to fix it.
Yeah. What's it like moving from managing a group of officers to managing a mix of sworn personnel and civilians? And in some cases, it's mostly civilians. Like records is all civilian staff.
My
right?
entire staff now is civilian.
Okay.
you've been out in patrol stations a lot. You know what happens before roll call and during roll call, and
it's got its own culture.
It does. Yep. Just its own demeanor. And if we don't like you, we give you a hard time. If we like you, we give you an even harder time.
Right, exactly.
And that's just kind of how it rolls. You've never developed those relationships with people in civilian spots because you've never worked right alongside of them as you would another officer. And even if I haven't worked next to this officer, you have a preconceived thought of what they're capable of by what they've done before. And
a sworn uniformed officer, even though there's quite a bit of variety, they really are going to fall within a relatively narrow set of expectations.
Yeah. Either you can do the job or you can't.
Yeah. But civilians, that spectrum is a little wider. And,
much.
Yeah.
Well, and think about it. You and I are patrolmen together. I know your job and you know mine. Mm-hmm. Now you go into a role, you don't even know what their job is or if they're capable of doing it or not. And
there's no easy way to tell if they're being effective.
Right.
How do you overcome that, though? Especially as a supervisor. You're in charge.
I just hung out. I just sat down and learned what they did. I mean, from a records clerk to somebody who was programming the back end of, one of the network systems, I just sat down and was like, what are you doing? Can you tell me what you're doing and why you're doing it? And just spending time with the people and getting to understand what they do. So when they have an issue, either I can take it up the chain or to customer support or wherever it needs to go and say, hey, this is what we need to do. They can't complete this function.
Let's break it down just a little bit for your situation. You're over IT, and so there's all kinds of radio and computer communications that need to happen. You're over records, which means there's all kinds of data that needs to be collected and given to the public or given to internally inside the department.
Out to the state, out to the feds, everybody gets it.
And then there's also asset protection. A lot of people listening to this, if they're not law enforcement, are going to go, what is that? They can't even give a good guess to what asset protection is. What is that?
Asset protection is a wing of the police departments. We provide security to all of the UG buildings that they have determined will have a security presence.
Okay.
Whether they're
the government buildings.
Yeah. The main office building, City Hall, the annex, high traffic areas.
These are police officers or security or both?
They're armed security. A high percentage of them are retired police officers.
Okay.
It's a great way to keep, retired personnel around and help them cover the costs of their insurance. Their pension doesn't go as far as it used to, especially with the cost of things nowadays. And so they still get to be around, see the people they had worked around for many years and still provide a great service.
Still contribute.
Contributing every day.
Yeah. Okay. So these things are supposed to work. It's IT or it's records. They're supposed to be focused on certain tasks. But like any bureaucracy, other inefficiencies creep in and things get bogged down and people end up working on things that are not probably their primary task.
Right.
How quickly were you able to identify stuff like that? Were some of these things known like the first day, like, hey, I've got to figure out the problem that we're having over here? Or were some of those problems that only emerged after you looked at it for a while?
Both. Okay. Some of them were some known issues that just needed some good direction. Some of it was just somebody to carry the ball for them, say, hey, there's a lot of processes that happen back here, and I'm trying to keep them all running, but I need this to get pushed forward. So it was some of both. And then after a short amount of time in those units, it's like, why do we do this? And then start asking those questions. Why is this happening? Because this seems really inefficient. So my major and I sat down and kind of dug through a lot of stuff and talked to every one of the employees and interviewed them and talked to them about their job and their supervisor and, just interactions and relationships within their unit, and just really wanted to get a broad picture of what was happening. Not to point a finger at that say, hey, this is broken, but hey, how can we make this run better? And
but I tell you, any process, somebody can get a job And they're trained to do it a certain way, but then reality sets in. There's only so many hours in the day, and there's certain expectations from different people, and there's other little side tasks that creep in and become, a big part of your day. And pretty soon you get bogged down into a rut. You're in a routine, and someone comes in and says, "Hey, I want to change stuff." That's you may want it to change, you may want it to be better, you may want it to be like you were trained, but at the same time, you're not really wanting to change everything either.
Right.
Do you feel like when you had these interviews that people gave you like honest feedback, or do you feel like
it took a little while?
Okay.
To dig it out. Some of them were very content on what they were doing, but which
is natural.
Yeah. And they get used to it.
Yeah.
And they're okay with it. And when you ask them, but why do you do this? We would have them list out every single task that is their responsibility. And just, some of them catch you off guard and you're like, that sounds really antiquated, or like, why are we doing that?
Why are we still doing it this way? I hear
and then
that all the time.
Ask somebody else, and then ask a supervisor, and come to find out that they were simple rules that maybe applied 20 years ago to the process that was happening then.
Yeah.
But it no longer applies, but they were still basically doing it.
Yeah.
And so
how often is there a rule that exists because one person screwed up? And
blanket policy. Oof.
And now everybody's held back by a rule for a person that probably not only made the mistake once, but aren't even here anymore.
Right.
And now all of us are confined because we don't want to see that foolishness happen again.
Yeah.
Even though it probably never will. Yeah, that's...
And, so we sat down and checked off a bunch of things like this is going to go and that's going to go and this is going to get changed. And I was really amazed that when people heard that we were going to take some of the load off of them, the attitude really changed. People were...
They were able to see it as a good thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's all in the presentation as well. If you just throw out a bunch of changes and don't explain the whys.
No, people don't like change.
No.
They don't like that kind of change.
Yeah, then they bristle up and back gets stiff, and we're not doing that. That's dumb. Take 2 seconds, explain why. Hey, this was useful 20 years ago. It's not anymore. Cut it out. And we'll make your load lighter. Well, that gave people a lot more latitude in how much time they could spend in other processes and get other things done. And all of a sudden they saw their workload just getting a bit more manageable.
Okay, this is Chaplain Altick, the podcast editor, and I'm speaking to you from the editing bay, trying to make sense of this particular episode. Because at this point, Captain Dorsett and I start talking in detail. I mean, we go in the weeds. This is inside baseball, talking about reports and records and body-worn cameras and in-car cameras, and equipping cars and purchasing new cars for a department. And I mean, we really got in the weeds. Now, this was fascinating to me because I see these officers writing reports and I ride in these cars. And so I think anyone in Kansas City, Kansas is going to be like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. But I think it's too far into the weeds and too off topic for this particular episode. So I'm going to cut it. I'm going to take all of that out, like half an hour of material. I'm just going to cut that out and leave it on the editing room floor. If you've just got to know, then please go talk to Captain Dorsett. Maybe I could trim it down a little bit and use it someday in the future, but I don't think I'm going to. But I'm making an editorial decision that all of the really good stuff that Gregg is saying about transitions in your career and leadership and managing people, that's just too valuable to distract you with all of the interesting gear conversation. Now, back to the interview. You're someone who was on the streets for several years, and now you're in a support position, an admin kind of position, where you are changing procedures and equipment and trying to improve the lives of the people that are on the street. And I think that is a noble and a very useful way to, spend this phase of your career. But a lot of guys have a hard time transitioning out of that first stage where they're the doer. They're the one kicking down the door. They're the one out on the street. They're in the middle of the action.
Yeah.
And they love that part. That's part of why they got into law enforcement,
Sure.
was to be hands-on. And that's great, except that you can't do that forever.
No.
At some point, it just takes a toll on you. You get older, you get exhausted, you get worn down, and a change of scenery might be really healthy for you. And it doesn't require that you leave law enforcement. It just may require moving to the other side of the house. So what advice do you have for officers who maybe need a transition or are looking for a transition, but they're not necessarily wanting to leave their department? Can they find a role like what you had?
Absolutely. I would think back to when I was either a patrolman or a young sergeant, and the captains and majors that included you. Mm-hmm. They talked to you about things that they were working on and things they were doing, and they sought your input. Unbeknownst to you, they're mentoring you.
Yeah.
I have a pretty good group of about 5 or 6 other captains and a couple majors, and we bounce everything off of each other. Mm-hmm. And maybe our projects are completely different from each other and have nothing to do with each other, but a different perspective. So don't ever get lost in what you think you need to be doing and where you think you need to go, but get those perspectives from other people. We have to do better at keeping those people around that have incredible knowledge. Maybe they are ready to be done with the job that they're in now, mm-hmm. but where can we transition that experience and knowledge into, maybe it's not a position of leadership, but an informal one. Mm-hmm. Especially a guy who's worked hard and has kind of been in the front line his entire career. The last thing he wants to hear is, oh, you're going to an admin role. Put him in a position where he is still part of that team or a team, mm-hmm. where he can share that knowledge and experience. I think about motorcycle cops. They're kind of cast out on an island on their own. Mm-hmm. Why? Because they do a job that is completely different mm-hmm. than anybody else in the department. Nobody knows those bikes and how they work from those bikes, and just working from that role better than they do. Can we create a position that is maybe administrative in nature, but doesn't lose that experience? Yeah. Somebody that would help that captain or sergeant, whoever is running that unit, to just take care of administrative things so the sergeant and captain can be more focused on the leadership things they need to be doing to run their unit. Yeah. Same thing with SWAT for SOU. Something that would take some of the administrative load off of the sergeants and the captains, maybe coordinating training or buying equipment or getting supplies, or, hey, we need to look at replacing these things, but next time we do it, we should incorporate these. Somebody who is the go-getter, gets it done, and still contributes mm-hmm. on a regular basis. You can't be on the SWAT team anymore. That phase of your career is past. Yeah. But you could be the one with the institutional knowledge to talk to the right vendor and get the right equipment, right. and make those decisions, because you don't want someone who's never been on a SWAT team buying equipment for the SWAT team. Right. And that happens. Same thing with motor units and other specialized units. Yeah. You got people making decisions that have never actually been on a bike about what equipment goes on the bike. You don't want that, and you need to avoid that. And that's where some of the negative quality of life things happen for an officer. Yeah. And then you drive those people out, and you lose on the retention end. You start losing officers because they're not taken care of well. You brought up cars earlier. We always just said, hey, garage, we need 25 new cars this year. Let us know when they're ready. Mm. Well, who's building our cars and planning them out, how they're laid out and what's included in them and how they're set up? Garage staff, it's not their fault. They've just never done the job. Yeah. And those, like we had this conversation earlier about equipment. I went and talked to the fleet manager, and he goes, I don't want to build your police cars. He goes, I want to assemble them, but you need to plan them out. I don't know what you need. Right. So you need to tell us what, where, and how, and then we'll make the rest happen. I thought that was a fantastic approach and cut out hours worth of conversation. Just like, you tell me what you need and we will get it done. Yeah. because this is not
a garage technician who's never been a cop shouldn't be writing up the plans. He shouldn't be designing.
He may know, the characteristics of this light and this equipment and the best way to connect it to make it most functional. But where it goes in relation to where the officer is going to access it and use it, that needs to be back with the people that actually use it. Like you just said with buying SWAT equipment, that needs to be SWAT guys. It's their stuff.
Yeah.
If it doesn't work for them, they're not going to use it, and that's just a waste of taxpayer money and blown resources on our end when we could have got something different or better.
Yeah.
I go back to that phone call right before when I was told I was getting moved to this role, and I was pretty upset with the deputy chief. And he said, "Listen, there's a completely different side of this house that you need to learn. This is a really big house. There are a lot of moving pieces of this department, most of which we never see, we never touch, may not even know they exist. Mm-hmm. And go seek those out. There's some really cool stuff that happens behind the scene that you can impact and help fix processes and make things better for the guys on the street, whether it be training, policy, just our normal day-to-day procedure or, equipment, anything else. Remember those things that you didn't like when you were out there and how you can make them better for the future."
Excellent. Any other advice on making big changes specifically in your career, going from being the doer to being the manager, being the supervisor, being the support person?
I think about the guys that have had amazing careers, and just because you hit a certain age or a certain time on the job, or you've punched your ticket, you got enough numbers, you can go. Do you need to go? I think about having the purpose we were here in the first place was to fulfill a mission that we thought we were set up to do. Why does that end because you hit a number? I just think about that experience and what they could continue to contribute just by being a presence in the agency. And just, I see those guys walk into a room and people look and they're like, "Oh, I know that guy. Man, that guy's done some stuff. Yeah. He's made it." That in itself is incredibly motivating. I think creates a resiliency. It's like, if he can do it, I can do it.
Yeah.
If he can stick it out this long. So just the presence of those senior guys that we found another spot and continue to allow them to contribute. And who knows, maybe they find something new that they're good at that extends their career another 5 years just because they want to be here.
Yeah.
They've stuck around this long for a reason.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you, Gregg. I appreciate you coming in.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Jared.
Gregg is one of several officers in my department that I keep coming back to help me understand cops and law enforcement in general. And of course, anytime I have a gun question, he's, go-to guy. He's also one of the ones that I'm thinking about when I talk about hard-earned wisdom. I mean, 14 years as a patrol sergeant, that's longer than a lot of people's entire careers. So make sure you go back and listen to episode 4 and hear how he got into law enforcement in the first place. It's a great story, and it's one that runs opposite of the career flow that we usually see. On the next episode of Hey Chaplain.
I remember one call where there were 3 officers already on scene. The guy was cussing them up and down. He was just mad at everybody, and I showed up as another back, and when I walked in, he immediately was like, "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for my language. I apologize." Oh. And just completely changed, and the guys I was working with were like, "What the heck?" Like,
Emily, that's a rare thing that I'm talking to a cop and they tell me a story I have never heard before. That's a first.
Yeah, but it was 3 male officers that were there, and he said that his mother raised him to be respectful to women, and so when he saw me, he had to go into that mode, even though he was not happy cops were there, and yeah, it was funny.
I want to make sure that I give a special thank you to the people who support me on buymeacoffee.com/HeyChaplain. The ones who support me on a monthly basis, just $5, $10 every month, man, that makes a difference. You are the ones paying the bills and making this show happen. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The views expressed here are the personal views of the host and our guests and do not necessarily represent the views of any law enforcement agency or its components. If you like this episode, please share it with a cop or someone who loves a cop. Thank you for listening to Hey Chaplain, and as always, pray for peace in our city.